Hello all, I am back and it has been a big week for Godzilla fans. Specifically, November 3rd, 2024 marked a very special occasion for the King of the Monsters, the date of his 70th birthday. Godzilla is now 70 years old, 7 decades of fun and destruction for cinema's greatest monsters. So this video will be dedicated to Godzilla, and we'll have a lot of fun things to talk about, especially the things that came out of Godzilla Day and the festivities and all that other fun stuff, because Toho made a lot of announcements in regards to Godzilla. So let's get started with the biggest news, probably the most exciting news. Takashi Yamazaki, who is the director of the heavily acclaimed Godzilla Minus One, is now slated to direct another Godzilla movie. What that movie will be, we do not know. But it is exciting that he is returning to the franchise, that he helped really get a lot of positive attention for, because even people outside of the fan base were really excited about Minus One and really praised it. And of course, it won an Academy Award. So a lot of positivity surrounding that film. And the idea of him coming back to direct a potential sequel, again, we don't really know what this film is going to be, is very exciting. I look forward to seeing what he does. And hey, more Godzilla movies is more fun for me, so bring it on. I'm completely cool with that. We also got announcements about a Godzilla Digimon collaboration, whatever the heck that is. I've never watched Digimon, so I have no connection to that property at all whatsoever. But I do know that some of the monsters and creatures that exist within that universe look kind of cool. It's kind of like it always felt like it was like a knockoff of Pokemon, but with like a little bit more of an edge to it, like a little bit. Like I guess I would, if I had to compare it to anything, it would probably be like the Garbage Pail Kids version of Pokemon, because it always seemed like it was a little bit more extreme than whatever Pokemon was doing. But I never watched Pokemon either, so I don't really know all that much about all these little monsters. I specialize in big monsters, not little monsters. But whatever this collaboration is going to be, I'll be sure to check it out, and I'm sure we'll know more as more news comes out. We also got news about a new Godzilla manga that's being developed, which is great. I don't know if that will make its way stateside, but we'll see. And of course, another exciting thing that came out of Godzilla Day was the annual short film, All Monsters Showdown, the continuation of last year's short, Godzilla vs. Jet Jaguar. We got a follow-up with Godzilla and Jet Jaguar teaming up against King Ghidorah, and it's all done in the classic tokusatsu, man-in-suit style of special effects filmmaking, what put Godzilla on the map, or what Godzilla helped put on the map, that whole special effects technique. That's gone out of style in the last 20 years, but these short films that they've been doing year after year have been a very nice and fun tradition, and keeping that part of the Godzilla history alive. So I really appreciated those short films. And once again, the short film was great. It was wonderful to see. Jet Jaguar has really come on. I remember when Jet Jaguar was like a punchline to every joke that Godzilla fans would tell. And now he's like, over time, he's become like a beloved icon, to where something like this short is seen as like a celebration of him rather than a mockery, which is what he was for a long time. Now it's like Jet Jaguar is considered an icon of the franchise, and shorts like this only help to enhance his status within the fan base. So yeah, I thought the short was great. Wonderful, maybe even the best one they've done so far. All of them have been really good. I really like the Ghidorah one. I really like the Gigan one. Last year's was a lot of fun with Godzilla and Jet Jaguar, and this one even probably even better than that. So yeah, I hope they keep these shorts going, because they're a lot of fun and I really enjoy them. Although this one did feel like kind of the end of the storyline that they've been doing for the last 5 years, doing these short films. So if they do decide to end them, I think this is a really good one to end on, and it was very satisfying, very fun. It was nice to see the man-in-suit style Godzilla action a few more times, to say the least. Now, one thing that did surprise me, we did not get a Gemstone animated short this year. That had also become kind of an annual tradition, getting the annual shorts. We got Godzilla vs. Gigan Rex a couple years ago, and that was very well received, and In many ways, it's like the best animated Godzilla we've ever gotten. And then we got a follow-up with Godzilla versus Megalon the next year, and that one was also really good. And you're thinking this year, it's like, okay, they did Gigan, they did Megalon. This year, it's going to be Mechagodzilla, right? And we haven't heard anything, so I don't know. I was expecting an animated short centered on Mechagodzilla, and maybe we'll get it. I don't know. We haven't heard anything. But I was a little surprised we didn't get one this year, because the previous 2 years, they've been great. So I say keep that going as well. But we'll just have to wait and see, I guess. I was just a little surprised we didn't get one. And now let's bring up my announcement. I have something that I want to announce on my end as far as my small contribution to Godzilla's 70th anniversary, and that's in regards to my book, Godzilla, the Monster Fight Record. Announcement. I am working on a second edition specifically to celebrate Godzilla's 70th anniversary with a new cover. And volumes 1 and 2 condensed into, not condensed, I'm not cutting anything out, combined into one book. And I'm going to be making that available soonish. My original goal was to have it done by the end of the year, but all of my health issues, kind of got in the way of that. So that has been delayed. So it'll be done when it's done. Hopefully I can finish it probably by March is kind of my goal. And what I'll be doing with this new edition, I'm going to be updating the manuscript to kind of jazz it up a little, make it a little bit more visually appealing. I know one of the complaints against my book was the lack of pictures, which I can't really control that because I don't own any photos of any of the Godzilla films. So that's a rights issue. I'm not going to start putting images of Godzilla films in my book and then have Toho lay the hammer down on me. Don't want to have that happen, but I am going to try and jazz up the manuscript a little bit to make it a little bit more visually appealing. I'm also going to be updating the record to include new entries. Since I published the fight record, there have been 2 new Godzilla movies, -1 and Godzilla X Kong: The New Empire, the latter of which greatly contributes to a fight record with new monsters and new battles for both Kong and Godzilla, so plenty of stuff to work with there. Additionally, I'm expanding the scope of the record to include various other things. I talked about the short films from the annual Godzilla Day celebrations. Those will be included in the record, since I view them as a continuation of the classic man-in-suit style Godzilla action. It only makes sense for me to include those as part of a Godzilla fight record. I will also be including the 2 animated shorts, Godzilla vs. Gigan Rex and Godzilla vs. Megalon, and I will be including the supplementary material from the Monsterverse, the wider continuity of the Legendary Pictures films. Thus far, we have Godzilla 2014, Kong Skull Island, Godzilla King of the Monsters, Godzilla vs. Kong, and Godzilla X Kong: The New Empire, the 5 films. In addition to that, there's several comics that are tie-ins that were used as kind of like preludes to promote the movie. There was Godzilla Awakening, there was Birth of Kong, Godzilla Aftermath, Godzilla Dominion, Kingdom Kong, and a few other comics released as supplementary material for the Monsterverse. There's also the TV shows that have come out. There's Netflix animated show Skull Island, which is said to be part of the Monsterverse. It didn't feel like it when I watched it, but it's said to be part of the Monsterverse. And a show that does feel closely connected to the Monsterverse, Monarch: Legacy of Monsters, which is currently filming season 2. It did contribute a few new monsters and a couple of new battles to add to a fight record, specifically one battle for Godzilla in the final episode. So that will also be included. So I'm actually expanding the scope to include comics and TV shows, which is a little bit different, and I'm going to have to tackle that a little bit differently from how I address the films, but since they fit into the wider continuity of the Monsterverse, and in the interest of giving the Monsterverse monsters, specifically that version of Godzilla, a complete fight record, that will all be included in the fight record. So it's going to be all one book, volumes 1 and 2 combined, a few extra things here and there, expanded scope, and other goodies thrown in for good measure, and a new cover as well. So be on the lookout for that. It will be coming out soon. The way I see it, I have until November 2025, when Godzilla turns 71, for this thing to count as like a celebration of the 70th anniversary. So again, be on the lookout for that. It's fun to kind of revisit this and kind of tweak it a little bit and fix it a little bit, but hopefully you all enjoy that when it ultimately gets released. And now let's get into the bulk of this video. What I wanted to do to commemorate 70 years of Godzilla. Even though I've reviewed pretty much every Godzilla movie, I reviewed them all back in 2014 on this channel, and I've reviewed every Godzilla movie that's been released since then. I thought it would be fun to kind of go into Godzilla's past and take a look at the films that commemorated a decade of Godzilla. So every 10 years, there's a Godzilla film that gets released. Well, one year there were two. That kind of signifies a big milestone in Godzilla's career. And I thought it'd be fun to take a look at those films and kind of view them all together and see how they kind of represent Godzilla's entire history when you take a look at all of those unofficial anniversary films and see like how Godzilla brought in each new decade, or how Godzilla completed each new decade of his career. So let's get started with 1964's Mothra vs. Godzilla. Now, this is an entry that's been heavily celebrated among the fan base, and it took place on Godzilla's 10th anniversary, 1964. Godzilla was 10 years old, and my, oh my, how much had changed in 10 years, where, you know, when that original film was first released, Godzilla was a very ambitious project for Toho, because they had never done a monster movie before. 10 years later, they were pretty much a monster factory, and that was kind of what they were known for. Toho did many, many, many other films, historical dramas and comedies and various other things, but they will be forever linked with kaiju and giant behemoths and all that other good stuff. And in the 10 years between Godzilla 1954 and Mothra vs. Godzilla, we had gotten Mothra, obviously Godzilla's co-star in this film. We'd gotten Kong vs. Godzilla the first time, the major crossover, East versus West, America versus Japan, battle of the all-time great cinematic monsters. We got Varan, we got my personal favorite outside of Godzilla, besides Godzilla, Rodan. We got the Mysterians, their first alien invasion film. We got Gorath, the rogue planet, which is, if you've ever seen Deep Impact or anything like that, like this movie was like the trendsetter for films of that nature. Lots of different monsters, lots of different movies, and they would only continue to make more and more as the years went on. So 1964 was a big deal, though, because this was the first time Mothra vs. Godzilla that Toho decided to cross over two of their major monsters together. Godzilla and Mothra were their two most popular monsters. Mothra in particular was a big hit with kids and a big hit with women. And so it was only natural to put Mothra together with Godzilla, and it made magic. And now it's like the two monsters are forever linked with each other. You almost can't think of one without thinking of the other. And Mothra has been one of Godzilla's greatest recurring guest stars, and on the Mount Rushmore of Godzilla opponents and allies. Mothra is an icon all its own. And you almost can't envision Godzilla's history without her. And you look at this film, Mothra vs. Godzilla, it's basically Toho's equivalent to Frankenstein meets the Wolfman, which was the first time that Universal Studios did a crossover of their own with their own band of monsters, having the Frankenstein monster meet up with the Wolfman and all the fun that ensued there. So this was a big deal. And the end result was a film that is highly regarded among the fan base, rightfully so. I think that this film represents the high mark of quality for the Showa period and for all of Godzilla's key creators. It's arguably Ishiro Honda's best job as director in handling the human drama side of things. I would probably go the 1954 route, is probably more his magnum opus in this franchise, but Mothra vs. Godzilla is a very, very, very close second. It's arguably Akira Ifukube's greatest score. Akira Ifukube is the monster maestro who produced great musical track after great musical track, one great score after another for Godzilla and many other monsters. And this movie is probably his best work, because not only did he do the great Godzilla battle themes that we all know and love, but he also proved that he could tackle Mothra and be a little bit prettier and a little bit nicer as well. And I think this is probably his best work, which is saying a lot, because I love that man's work. He gave Godzilla his soul in many ways. And so for this to be his greatest work, I think is a major, major compliment. It's probably Haruo Nakajima's best performance as Godzilla. He has a few other ones. And I think his personal best performance was in War of the Gargantuas, but that wasn't a Godzilla movie. But I think he really portrayed Godzilla very, very well here as like this, both a bit of a lumbering, clumsy oaf in some scenes, which really put over Godzilla's like size and how he really doesn't fit into the modern day, into the humans world. He's kind of an anomaly. And whether those like trips and falls were accidental or not, or whether or not they were planned, doesn't really matter. It just kind of paints the picture that Godzilla does not belong here, and he's in a world that is not made for him. And that was conveyed very well. And when it's time to be fierce and scary, this is probably Godzilla, or at least Nakajima's Godzilla at its very best. So I thought his performance as Godzilla was great. I think the special effects work of E.G. Tsuburaya and his team was top-notch this time around, arguably their best work in the entire series. You know, this movie was made in 1964, and I don't think Mothra, the fully grown butterfly Mothra, has ever looked better than she did in this film. She looked like a living, breathing creature, and ironically, the best example of that is probably the scene where Mothra dies at the end of her battle with Godzilla, where she's struggling to breathe, and they were able to convey that with a puppet, and a big puppet with like all these wires and all these things going on. Really wonderful stuff. So if you want like a high-class, high-quality kaiju film, you can't do much better than Mothra vs. Godzilla. It's one of the best entries in the series, and highly celebrated as such for good reason. So, if this list of anniversary films turns into kind of like a pseudo recommendations list, Mothra vs. Godzilla is one that absolutely should be on everybody's view list if you want to get into the series and find out more about it. And 1964 was a big year for Godzilla because it's the only year of his career where 2 Godzilla movies got released. The second one coming out at the end of the year was Ghidorah, the Three-Headed Monster. And it's funny because in between Mothra vs. Godzilla and Ghidorah, the Three-Headed Monster, virtually the same cast and crew also worked on, released, and produced Dogora, the Space Monster, the movie with the giant jellyfish space monster that eats diamonds, and there's, you know, the whole crime drama story element to it as well. So they were very busy that year making monster movies. That cast and crew, they really brought their A game in 1964. But Ghidorah the Three-Headed Monster is a massive, very important film in Godzilla's history because not only does it introduce the monster that many would recognize as Godzilla's arch nemesis in King Ghidorah, it also works in Mothra, it works in Rodan, and it works in, obviously, Godzilla together to join forces to stop this intergalactic threat. And it's really, like, if the previous film was Toho's Frankenstein meets the Wolfman, then this was their House of Dracula or House of Frankenstein, where it combined a whole group of monsters together into a massive, massive crossover. And this film is immensely entertaining. A must-watch if you're a kaiju fan or a Godzilla fan. It is one of the major highlights of the series. Ghidorah is an instant hit. A giant, lightning-spitting, golden space dragon is one of the most classic and greatest designs for any monster in this franchise, and it's easy to see why he became like the big bad or like the Thanos to Godzilla's Avengers, and why it usually takes, you know, I mentioned the Avengers, it usually takes Godzilla getting some help to fight off and defeat King Ghidorah. Like in most movies, like Godzilla has some kind of an ally to help him, whether it's Mothra, Rodan, Anguirus in later films, Jet Jaguar in the recent short film. That's a common thread with King Ghidorah, and it really highlights just how powerful, you know, this space dragon really is. So the movie is immensely entertaining. I think they picked the perfect 3 monsters because Godzilla and Mothra, obviously the big stars. Rodan, my personal favorite aside from Godzilla, and is the fast flyer of the group, and that original Rodan film I think is great. So bringing Rodan back is, was a welcome move on my part because I just love Rodan so much. And Rodan proved to be immensely useful in the final battle, and even gave Godzilla a run for his money because most of the film has them fighting each other, and it's like, man, Rodan's kind of winning this fight if you go back and watch it. But for a pure monster spectacle, this movie is a delight to watch. You get to see Mothra, Rodan, and Godzilla actually sit down and talk to each other, which is hilarious and great. And this is also a big film for Godzilla because it was the day of his big, to use wrestling terminology, his big face turn, because Godzilla for the first time finds himself on the side of good, trying to protect the Earth from a greater threat. He wasn't a full-fledged superhero yet. That would come a few films later. But this was the first time where Godzilla was positioned as the good monster, and also the first time he gets to end a film kind of standing tall and being on top and getting a win. And that was big for me as a kid, because up to that point, I had seen King Kong versus Godzilla. Godzilla loses at the end. And I fell in love with Godzilla almost instantly, so I was like, oh, he lost. And then I watched Godzilla Raids again. He beats Anguirus, but then ultimately gets trapped in an iceberg at the end of the film, so he loses again. I'm like, okay. And then the next one I saw was Mothra versus Godzilla, ends with the baby Mothras encasing Godzilla in webbing, and Godzilla loses again. And at this point, I was like, does Godzilla ever win at the end of these things? Like, come on. I mean, I love the guy. Can we give the guy a win? Which at that point, because Godzilla was a bad guy still, it's kind of like rooting for Freddy Krueger or Jason. But I just loved him so much. I'm like, can Godzilla get a win, for God's sake? So thankfully, Ghidorah the three-headed monster came along at the exact right time. Because as a kid, I remember going nuts when Godzilla and Rodan joined in the fight to help fight off King Ghidorah. And then Godzilla wins in the end. I was like, yeah. That's cool. So, really the start of nothing but good trends and wonderful vibes from the Godzilla series. So again, if you're looking for recommendations for the Godzilla series, Ghidorah the Three-Headed Monster, I think, is a must-watch. And now let's move forward to Godzilla's 20th anniversary, 10 years later, 1974. And by this point, Godzilla had fought and beat them all, from King Ghidorah to Hedorah to Gigan to Megalon and just about everything in between. Godzilla had torn through just about every monster you could possibly imagine. So what was left for the big guy? Well, Toho went for the gusto for the 20th anniversary and brought out one of Godzilla's greatest enemies ever. So much so that if Ghidorah is the 1A, this one is the 1B challenging that spot for Godzilla's number one enemy, and that is Mechagodzilla, his robotic doppelganger, and very persistent enemy because of all of the monsters introduced during the 1970s. Mechagodzilla is by far the most recurring of the bunch, so he was a big hit right out the gate. And Mechagodzilla is awesme, the Swiss Army knife of kaiju, with so many gadgets and weapons, and the finger missiles and the eye lasers and all that, the force field that blocks Godzilla's atomic breath. That Showa version of Mechagodzilla, all these years later, and with all the different versions that have come up in the Heisei era, the Millennium era with Kiryu, and the MonsterVerse version that we saw in Godzilla vs. Kong, of all of those different versions of Mechagodzilla, the Showa version is still my favorite. I just love that, industrialized, kind of harsh look to it, and of course all of the gadgets and weapons that it has. It's just a delight to watch, especially when he lets loose and just blows up everything in sight. So, Godzilla vs. Mechagodzilla, 1974, is a film that has a lot going on. It's got like an alien invader plot. It's got a little bit of a family drama with the doctor and his daughter being held captive by the aliens, him being forced against his will to help repair Mechagodzilla. It's got the spy angle with the Interpol agents trying to find out what the aliens are up to, and there's a mystical angle as well with the King Caesar statue and awakening King Caesar as an ally for Godzilla. So this movie's very busy. There's a lot going on, but it's also a lot of fun. One of the more enjoyable 70s films, and actually director Jun Fukuda, whose Godzilla films, beginning with Ibira the Terror of the Deep, Horror of the Deep, and moving on throughout the later parts of the Showa era, his films were generally considered on the lower end of quality, although he was also the one that was in the chair when the budgets and everything else was decreasing. So maybe he didn't always get the credit for making quality films, or at least making films that were good enough under the constraints that he was working under. But I think of all the films he did, and this is his last one, I think Godzilla vs. Mechagodzilla in 1974 is the best one he made. I think it's a highly entertaining film, lots of fun, has some of that 70s cheese that kind of helps it fit in with that era, but also delivers some of the greatest monster action you will ever see in the Godzilla series. And I'll even say this, because I wrote the book on the subject, the Godzilla fight record and all that stuff. If I had to pick a favorite Godzilla battle in Godzilla's entire career, I'm probably going to go with the climactic battle from Godzilla vs. Mechagodzilla, because it's Godzilla and King Caesar fighting this unstoppable robot that is just unleashing one weapon and one surprise after another. It's just beating them to death. And it's one of the most vicious beatings that Godzilla has ever received. So much so that at one point, blood starts shooting out of his neck like a sprinkler. And Godzilla is just left a bloody mess by the end of it. But true to character, true to form, Godzilla gets up, perseveres, fights back, unleashes a new ability of his own, the ability to generate a magnetic force to pull Mechagodzilla to him. And it's one of the most satisfying conclusions to any monster battle ever, especially when Godzilla finally grabs hold of Mechagodzilla, twists his head back, smashes him right in the mouth, and ends the battle right then and there. Immensely satisfying. And it's kind of got that... again, like I said, it's true to Godzilla's character that he would get blown up and blasted all throughout this entire fight, but then keep getting up and keep coming back and keep persevering to ultimately win the day. Because Godzilla is, aggression personified, and you just cannot keep a good monster down. And it's fun to see that kind of like unconquerable spirit in Godzilla, like a Rocky Balboa, like a Hulk Hogan during Hulk Hogan's prime. That type of element to Godzilla's character is one of the reasons he's so endearing, and I think that battle just personifies it perfectly. Perfect microcosm for Godzilla's entire character, and that battle is immensely fun to watch. So, great climax to an overall very, very entertaining film, and another one that I think is kind of required viewing for anybody looking to get into the Godzilla series, and a perfect way to celebrate Godzilla's 20th anniversary. And from there, we move on to Godzilla's 30th anniversary. Now, the decade between Godzilla's 20th and 30th anniversaries is very interesting because not a whole lot happened. There was one more movie, Terror of Mechagodzilla, and then Godzilla went on a break, at least for movies. There were a few other things here and there. There was the Marvel Comics series, there was the Hanna-Barbera animated show, but for the most part, Godzilla was kind of dormant during the next decade of his life. But this was also the period where I think a lot of, at least in America, like a lot of American fans kind of were discovering and getting into Godzilla, and more of the movies were being released, and VHS was becoming a thing, and that kind of exposed Godzilla to a whole new generation of fans. So I think there was, while there wasn't a whole lot of new content, there was a new age of discovery for Godzilla, and where a lot of young fans were kind of getting into the character. And this is also when a lot of the movies started to air on TV regularly. This was certainly... in the latter half of the 1980s is when I got into it, and when I, started my whole journey in discovering everything, everything there is to discover about this guy. So, it was kind of but overall it was kind of a dark period for Godzilla. Not a whole lot going on until the 30th anniversary rolled around, and Toho rolled out the red carpet for their icon once again with The Return of Godzilla, a film that, ushered in a new era of Godzilla, started a whole new series of films, and updated Godzilla for a modern audience, updated special effects, and kind of a return to form, because this film made the bold decision to be like, okay, look, the 14 sequels never happened. The original film happened, and now we're going to operate as if Godzilla was gone for 30 years after the original film, and then he returns into the 1980s amidst a very tumultuous political landscape with the Cold War and everything else going on. And putting Godzilla into that world was again, treating him as if he'd been gone for 30 years, and there was no hero, redemption arc for Godzilla or anything like that. Kind of reintroducing him as a giant nuclear-powered force of destruction was a stroke of brilliance, and really made that film feel like more of a political drama than anything else. And I think there's a lot to admire about what they accomplished with that film. They had some of the grim atmosphere of the original film. I think they recaptured at least some of it. The human drama was nowhere near as good. Most of the human cast is kind of boring, unfortunately. But helping them out, though, I do really like the Prime Minister of Japan in this film, because the look on his face in every scene just makes it look like he's got the weight of the world on his shoulder, and it's not just, my decisions aren't just, whether is this going to stop Godzilla, but am I going to make a decision that hurts us more than it helps us? I don't know. And he's got to weather that storm, especially dealing with, the USSR and the USA and their own disagreements and opinions on the matter. So a lot of interesting angles going on with how Godzilla is handled in this kind of political landscape, and that makes for a very interesting film, if not necessarily one of my favorites. The American version brought back Raymond Burr, who was famously inserted into the American version of the original film, and I have great admiration for Raymond Burr as an actor and as an advocate for Godzilla. He stated several times that he enjoyed being a part of the Godzilla series and loved the character, loved the message of the movies, and took it seriously. He didn't see, and this is a guy that acted, with Hitchcock in Rear Window, and he's great in that film. Kind of a bit part, but he's great in it. This is a guy who was Perry Mason, one of the kings of television. Big name actor, and the fact that he took Godzilla seriously and enjoyed his own contributions to the series, I think is very admirable. And a lot of talk has been made about whether or not it's right to alter the Japanese originals in translating them over for American audiences. But I think getting Raymond Burr involved in the Godzilla franchise, I think is just a win for us as fans. So I appreciated his contributions for it. And he classes up the American version of that film tenfold, because without him it would have been terrible. So it's like, because many of the other actors in those scenes are not very good. There's the obvious Dr. Pepper promotion, which is almost comical. It's almost like that scene in Wayne's World with the product placement and everything. It's how obvious and on the nose it is. But Raymond Burr's presence and his big speech at the end really class up the American scene. So there was some good to including Raymond Burr in the American version of the film. But regardless of whichever version you watch, and strangely enough, the Japanese version is actually easier to find these days. I do think the Return of Godzilla is a good start to a new series. I think we would get better entries as the Heisei series continued. But overall, I think it is a perfectly serviceable 30th anniversary film and reintroduces Godzilla in a big way. And now let's jump to the 40th anniversary film. And by this point, like I said, The Return of Godzilla kicked off a whole new series of Godzilla films. And the Heisei series yielded some of my favorite entries in the Godzilla franchise. Godzilla vs. Biollante, Godzilla vs. King Ghidorah, Godzilla vs. Mechagodzilla in 93. Great stuff. And the film after this one, Godzilla vs. Destoroyah, would end the series and possibly for a time end the franchise, although that didn't last long, and end the series by killing off Godzilla. So that was a huge milestone, huge event entry in Godzilla's career. But we're going to be talking about the film that preceded it, Godzilla vs. SpaceGodzilla, which is notable for introducing SpaceGodzilla, who is one of the more audacious enemies in Godzilla's list of rogues and opponents. And I found that SpaceGodzilla is very eye-catching to people who are not fans of the series. I may have told the story before when I reviewed the movie, 10 years ago, but more than one person has looked at my DVD shelf and they see Godzilla vs. SpaceGodzilla and they instantly go, "There's a SpaceGodzilla?" And I'm like, yeah, there is. And it's a wacky one, to be sure. And the funny thing about SpaceGodzilla is that when I was a kid, there was the Trendmasters Godzilla toy line, which was released at around the same time as when Power Rangers was at its peak. So no doubt, Power Rangers influenced the decision to kind of, hey, let's release some Godzilla toys over here, because it's kind of the same thing, and we could get some of that bleed over. And it was outstanding as a fan back then to get a Godzilla toy line, but unfortunately, the 90s films were not being released here stateside, and there was no internet, so I didn't even know those films existed. So when SpaceGodzilla showed up in the Godzilla toy line and treated as the major enemy, I didn't know there was a SpaceGodzilla movie. I thought he was an invention of the toy line. I thought this toy line just invented a new enemy for Godzilla. And it was like, whoa, look at this crystallized blue evil looking Godzilla. That looks pretty neat. It's like, wow, these toy makers, they really worked hard on this design. This looks awesome. And even funnier than that, I played the video game Super Godzilla, and at the end of that game, you can evolve Godzilla into a more powerful form called Super Godzilla. Very clever with the name there. And the design looks almost identical to Space Godzilla. And I never put two and two together. That's like, hey, wait a minute, something's going on here. Because I remember the toy line commercials having footage, live action footage of Godzilla and Space Godzilla fighting each other, and it came from this movie. And I didn't know that. I thought it was, oh, wow, they really went all out with this toy commercial. That's amazing. So it's just hilarious to think there was a point in my life where I thought Space Godzilla was an invention of a toy company and not an actual character in the Godzilla franchise. So it's funny how that played out. But anyway, I did eventually see all the 90s films, including this one. This was actually the last one of the Heisei films that I was able to get my hands on because for whatever reason, like this one wasn't this one was a little harder to find. I'm not sure why, but I eventually did get it, eventually saw it. And unfortunately, I have to say, it's arguably the weakest of the Heisei era films. It's either that or Godzilla vs. Mothra. I'm not a huge fan of that one either. But this one had a rushed production. There was a bit of a production hell going on, and it took them a while to get started on producing this thing. So there are signs of a rushed production. The special effects shots are not as clean as they maybe would have been if they had gotten a little bit more time. This one is definitely the most flawed of the Heisei era films. What I will say in its defense, though, SpaceGodzilla is great. Again, audacious. Very creative, very weird monster, to throw in there, right towards the end of the series. And it's like, okay, so we've done one clone of Godzilla. Let's do another clone, but instead of a robot, it's an alien. And it kind of worked out. Actually, like, with its telekinetic powers, it's like SpaceGodzilla was kind of like the kaiju version of, to use a Pokemon reference, kind of like Mewtwo or something like that. So, very interesting monster that helps carry the film. I also like this movie's version of Mothra. Mothra was the alien mecha introduced in the Mysterians, and great design. Didn't get to do a whole heck of a lot, and it was cool. Like, whenever they take a non-Godzilla movie and find elements of it or a monster from it to work into a Godzilla movie down the road, I'm always a supporter of that. I'm always a fan of that. I wish we would get Godzilla versus the Gargantuas at some point, but working Mothra into the Godzilla franchise, I thought was very cool. And it was nice to see that woodpecker looking thing, get to throw down a little bit with SpaceGodzilla. Proved to be immensely useful in the final battle, actually. It's the one time in the series where humanity and Godzilla, and when I say the series, I mean the Heisei series, because up to this point, Godzilla had been a thorn in the side of humanity. And, there wasn't that good guy arc for Godzilla in this series, but this is the one time where humanity and Godzilla work together to stop a greater threat. So it does have that going forward as well. There's also a subplot with the Yakuza, which doesn't really work, kind of slows the film down considerably. But overall, there are fun moments. There is a good time. Unfortunately, I think of all the anniversary films, this is probably the easiest one to skip. And there are better Heisei entries. Like I said, Godzilla vs. Biollante, Godzilla vs. King Ghidorah, Godzilla vs. Mechagodzilla, and Godzilla vs. Destoroyah. If you want to see the best of the Heisei series, I think those are the films you would go after. This one, it's all right. And now we jump ahead to Godzilla's 50th anniversary, and the decade between the 40th and the 50th anniversary was a very busy time for Godzilla. We saw the very first American Godzilla movie with the TriStar film. Didn't go very well, disappointed a lot of people, but with that disappointment came a whole new string of Godzilla movies produced by Toho to kind of make up for it. And we got 6 more entries in the series, a series known as the Millennium Films, the Millennium series of Godzilla entries, beginning with Godzilla 2000. And that series was interesting because instead of like a continuous storyline where the Showa films, continuity's kind of loose, but it's kind of assumed that they're all connected and there's a running story with the same Godzilla throughout the 15 films. The Heisei films is definitely one continuous story with each entry building off the previous one, and some entries connecting to previous entries 3 or 4 movies ago and things like that. This series has no continuity, with every entry being its own independent universe, except for Tokyo SOS, which is a follow-up to the previous film Godzilla vs. Mechagodzilla 2002. So, very interesting, very different series of Godzilla films, but it ended with Godzilla's 50th anniversary, Godzilla Final Wars, a film that was not well received when it first came out. I remember the initial reaction to that film was very negative. And it was like, ew, what the heck was this? What was this stupidity that they released for Godzilla's big half-century milestone of existence? But over time, and Godzilla movies have a weird way of doing this, over time, it found its audience, and it found its admirers and its lovers, and now it's kind of a celebrated entry in the franchise, for the most part. Various aspects of this film have gone on to become icons in their own rights. The Millennium version of Gigan is a celebrated design of that character. That version of Godzilla, the suit would actually go on to be used in the annual Godzilla live-action short films and is considered somewhat iconic all its own. And there are a lot of big moments in the film, namely Godzilla's battle with the American version, where he defeats it in under a minute. And Monster X, Kaiser Ghidorah, is the final boss, is considered to be an iconic enemy in Godzilla's pantheon that's different from the classic King Ghidorah. So there's a lot of things that have been admired about this film, but all of the criticisms against the film, I think, are valid as well. It's a very, it's not boring. Godzilla Final Wars is definitely not boring, and I think of all the anniversary films, this is the best one at being an anniversary film because it basically takes Godzilla's entire history, plasters it on the screen, throws in kung fu fighting and a ton of other things, and just has a nice wild ride throughout the entire time. So you won't be bored, definitely. It's certainly not a boring film. It is a somewhat messy one that doesn't make a whole lot of sense if you think about it for more than 5 minutes, but it is very fun, it is very exciting, and it is very entertaining. So I'm more on the middle with this one. Like, so, again, a lot of negativity thrown at it when it first came out. More and more fans have come to appreciate it as time has gone on. I'm more in the middle with it where it's like, it's a good time, but it's not one of my favorite entries. But it is certainly memorable, I'll give it that. And what makes it memorable is that it boasts the largest monster cast in the entire Godzilla series. And again, using the man-in-suit style special effects for most of the monsters. Manda is mostly CGI. The American Godzilla is entirely CGI, bad CGI, which felt like it was done on purpose. But then you have Godzilla, Gigan, Mothra, Rodan, Anguirus, King Caesar, Monster X/King Ghidorah, Kamacuras, Kumonga, Minya also makes a return in this film. I hope I got everybody. Did I get everybody? Ibira, Hedorah for a cameo. And I think I got everybody. I don't know. If I did, I'm sure somebody will comment on it down below. But a large cast of monsters creating some very cool moments throughout. I don't think they're utilized quite as well as maybe the large monster cast in Destroy All Monsters was utilized. But overall, it makes for a fun time, especially when Godzilla turns full-on Goldberg and just tears through every monster one by one in just a total squash fest, which is a lot of fun to watch. And then you get an explosive climax in Tokyo. And all of the human elements are action-oriented as well. Like I said, there's a lot of kung fu fighting throughout the film, so if you enjoy that, you'll get plenty of that here as well. We also get Colonel Gordon, who's one of the greatest Godzilla characters of all time, played by MMA fighter Don Frye. And Don Frye just looks like a badass, and he is. He's legitimately a badass. He's one of those guys that's like, man, I wish he'd gone into pro wrestling. I wonder what that would have looked like. Because, when MMA guys go into pro wrestling, it's you either get a Ken Shamrock or you get a Dan Severn, who I like Dan Severn a lot, but he just, the theatrical world of pro wrestling, like, he just didn't naturally fit with that. Well, Ken Shamrock did. He fit pro wrestling in WWE like a glove. So I wonder how Don Frye would have done if he actually did go into WWE and had a run there. I don't know, but we got him in Godzilla, and that's what matters. And he's a lot of fun. Not the greatest actor in the world, but he is a lot of fun in this movie. And that's pretty much the whole film. It's not perfect, but it is fun. And Final Wars, unfortunately, was kind of the end for Godzilla for a while, but I'll talk more about that when I talk about the next film. Now, before I talk about the 60th anniversary film of Godzilla, I want to talk about the decade between Final Wars and the Monsterverse and this beginning of the Godzilla renaissance that we've been seeing for the last decade. That period was probably the darkest period in Godzilla's career, and there was nothing going on to the point that, as a fan, it just kind of felt like Godzilla was a dead brand at that point. Like, there was just nothing new going on, nothing exciting, nothing at all. It was like Godzilla had just evaporated and disappeared. And, when Godzilla Final Wars came out, Toho actually destroyed or I guess you could say decommissioned, the giant pool that they would use for special effects sequences that were done in the water. And they'd been using that thing going all the way back to the original Godzilla film. So it really did feel like, Godzilla turned 50. We did this grand explosion of a finale, and that was it. It was like Godzilla was done and like kind of being put out to pasture, and it was the end of an era. And in the years between Godzilla Final Wars and Godzilla's 60th anniversary, it just felt like there was nothing going on. And there had been rumblings of like a new Godzilla movie, but it was like whispers, thrown into the wind, to the point that I was kind of like, I'll believe it when I see it. That was kind of my attitude at that point, because I had kind of gotten to a point where I was like, is Godzilla over? Like, is it just, there's just going to be no more? And at that point I was like, okay, 50 years, over 20 films, maybe that's it. Maybe we've had enough. I don't know. And that's a hell of a run. That's a great run for a great character and a great franchise. But is this it? Is that the end? Because I thought, man, are we never going to see another Godzilla movie? But sleeping dragons do not stay dormant forever. And I believe it was Comic-Con 2012, where out of nowhere, we got the announcement of a new Godzilla movie, where they debuted that amazing footage, the proof of concept footage for the 2014 Legendary Pictures Godzilla film, and it caught everybody by surprise. And again, there had been rumblings of a Godzilla film going on, but nothing concrete had ever really been presented to us. And to be perfectly honest, like the proof of concept footage for that 2014 film, which they hid for the longest time, like it was a while before that thing leaked on the internet. And I think Godzilla -1 is a better representation of what is in that proof of concept footage than what we ultimately got in the Legendary Pictures 2014 film. But it was still like, oh my God, Godzilla's coming back. And I was so excited for that 2014 film, but also kind of trepidatious because I remember how the 1998 film turned out. So I didn't want to get my hopes up too high. But that was the period on this channel when I was reviewing all of the Godzilla films, and I was kind of falling in love with Godzilla all over again because he was coming back, and I was super excited for it. And then I saw the 2014 film. It finally rolled around in May of 2014, Godzilla's 60th anniversary. And it was, to this day, I still think that's one of my all-time favorite theater experiences, was seeing that film opening night with a full packed house and an audience full of maybe Godzilla fans, maybe not. I don't know. I don't know how many Godzilla fans were in the audience that night, how many initiated, lifers were there that night. I have no idea. But to see them react like that, and to see them give Godzilla, a huge ovation for all of his big moments, treating it almost like a Marvel movie, it was very satisfying to see. And it showed that, 10 years on the shelf, 60 years of existence, there's still life in this character and in this franchise. And it was one of the most satisfying theater experiences I've ever had. Now, the 2014 film, is it perfect? No, I still think that Bryan Cranston's character was killed off way too soon and kind of halted the human drama from being as good as it could have been. But there were a lot of things that I liked. I liked the overall pace of it. I know some people criticized it for Godzilla not being in the film enough. I was okay with it because it kind of felt like an old school monster movie. The way he's kind of string me along, wine and dine me a little bit, and then pay it off at the end with a huge explosive finale. And that finale, the battle between Godzilla and the Mutos, I think is up there as one of the all-time great monster scenes, especially with how Godzilla killed the Mutos with the epic tail whip and the kiss of death, which is one of the greatest kaiju finishers of all time. And man, he wasn't in the film much, but whenever Godzilla was on screen, it definitely left an impact. And I would rather, and this is coming after watching so many Transformers films, those Michael Bay Transformers films, which are terrible. And the first one's okay. I still maintain the 2007 first one is okay. And then after that, it's just diminishing returns as, the worst excesses of Michael Bay as a director kind of rear its ugly head. But, after watching 2 or 3 or 4 of those films, it made me sick of Optimus Prime, which is a sin because I love Optimus Prime. So to make me sick of looking at him, like that's a sin. I feel like, so it's just, but these movies are just constantly throwing shit in your face over and over and over again. And it's just, you get bored watching all of this action that it's just throwing out there. And the 2014 film didn't do that. It was a very well done, well-paced monster movie, a creature feature. And I love the way it was shot. I love the way Gareth Edwards, who I respect as a director. I liked Rogue One. It's the only one of the Disney Star Wars films I'm even willing to revisit at this point. And I also liked his film, The Creator. I thought that film might beat out -1 for best visual effects. It's a beautiful looking film and a good film on its own. So that one, it didn't do well when it came out, but I hope it finds its audience because it's pretty damn good. So I do like Gareth Edwards as a director, and I thought he handled the material very, very well. Again, fix a couple things in the story and the writing, and I think it would be like a top tier, one of the best Godzilla movies. But as a reintroduction for Godzilla and as a kickoff point for the MonsterVerse, I think the 2014 film did its job very, very well and was a satisfying experience all around. And by the end of it, I was just sitting there going, yes, thank God, Godzilla is back. And ever since then, ever since the 2014 film, Godzilla has seen a resurgence unlike anything I would have ever imagined with the MonsterVerse films. He got to co-star with King Kong again, which was something I've wanted since I was a kid. Since I saw the original King Kong versus Godzilla, I wanted them to have a reunion film, and that was something that felt like a pipe dream, but we finally got it. That was great. We got to see King Ghidorah, Rodan, and Mothra in an American-made Godzilla film, my personal favorite of the MonsterVerse films. To be perfectly honest, 2019's Godzilla King of the Monsters. We got to see an animated Godzilla trilogy, which wasn't very good, but still, we got it. We've got several Godzilla projects and TV shows and comics and two new films from Toho, Shin Godzilla, which was great, and of course the highly celebrated Godzilla -1, which was even better than Shin Godzilla. And it's like, man, there's still some life in this old dog. Look at him. And, after 70 years of existence, Godzilla won his first Academy Award. So it just goes to show you can teach an old dog new tricks. And Godzilla has been around for a long time, but he continues to surprise and entertain audiences around the world. And this film, the 2014 Gareth Edwards Godzilla film, was the kickoff point for Godzilla's big renaissance period. And for that, I highly appreciate it. All right, let's wrap this up with Godzilla's 70th anniversary film, which is not Godzilla -1, even though it's called the 70th anniversary project, and it was labeled as such when it was released by Toho. It came out in 2023, which is technically Godzilla's 69th anniversary. 69. But so we won't be talking about that one today. What we will be talking about is the film that was actually released on Godzilla's 70th anniversary year, and that is Godzilla x Kong: The New Empire, the latest in the MonsterVerse, the sequel to Godzilla vs. Kong, and quite an interesting film and a very unique entry, especially coming off of -1, which was a very human driven, very well done, well executed, emotional drama that just happened to have a giant monster in it with some of the most horrifying city destruction scenes you will ever see. Godzilla -1 is an excellent, well-crafted film. And then you get this movie, which is just balls to the walls insanity, just like, yeah, we're just gonna have fun with this, and we're gonna have monkeys punching lizards and lizards, flying and all sorts of other crazy stuff. So yeah, we're just going for full-on Saturday morning cartoon stuff, which I know I just criticized the Michael Bay Transformers films, but there is a way to do that type of movie and keep it fun. And this one airs more on the side of like, let's keep it fun. It's not just mindless nonsense the entire time. And, some people kind of looked on this film a little negatively, comparing it to -1. And I've always been a big believer of one of the reasons for Godzilla's longevity is its surprising versatility. Like, it's like, all right, monster destroys a city. Like, what, how many different ways can you possibly do that type of movie? Turns out a lot, because sometimes Godzilla's serious, sometimes he's funny, sometimes it's pure spectacle, sometimes it's slower and more ponderous. A lot of different ways to do it. Some people have called it out. I remember when Godzilla vs. Kong came out, and some people called it out. It's like, man, the 2014 film was like so grounded and so realistic. And then you get to this movie and there's friggin' spaceships and flying around the center of the earth, which has its own little world built into it with the hollow earth and all that other stuff. And I'm like, yeah, that's kind of on par for Godzilla. When you look at the Showa series, yeah, the 1954 film, very grounded, very realistic. And then, by movie 4, they're singing fairies. By movie 6, they're going into outer space. It's a common thing with Godzilla. Heisei series, Grounded political drama is how it starts. And then by the next movie, there's genetic splicing and psychics. And then the film after that, there's time traveling. And then the film after that, there's magic fairies. And then the film after that, there's a giant robot. It's like SpaceGodzilla came next. And it's that always happens with Godzilla. It's like you start off realistic and then you go crazy. So I don't know. I feel like Godzilla X Kong, The New Empire is kind of on brand for, it's like, yeah, it's about the point where things start to get really silly for Godzilla and over the top. And it's just a question of whether or not you're on board with that insanity. I am completely on board with that insanity. So I really enjoyed kind of the reckless abandon that the film operates on. And I like that the monsters are the main characters. Like, it's really Kong's story exploring the Hollow Earth, trying to find a family before stumbling onto this greater threat with the Scar King and his army and his ultimate Death Star weapon of Shimo, the ice dinosaur, which I love. I love Shimo as like a new monster. I think sometimes when people try to create a new monster for a new Godzilla project or a new Kong project, sometimes they might try a little too hard in coming up with in like a crazy design or something like that. With Shimo, it's just like, let's just do an ice dinosaur. It's like, it's somewhat like, I don't know, cliched or whatever. It's something that a 7-year-old would come up with. But that simplicity kind of makes it great. And I'm kind of on board with that. But anyway, like, this is a film where you could have, and I wouldn't be surprised if it leaned more into this and like at the script level and they got notes from the studio. It's like, no, you have to have humans talking in this to at least explain what's going on. But I wouldn't be surprised if like the original draft had like almost no humans in it and they were just going to let the monsters drive the story with no dialogue, which we're getting closer to that with these MonsterVerse films. If they ever fully embrace that and just did a complete Godzilla and or Kong movie completely from the point of view of the monsters, I would kind of be on board with that just to see if they could do it with no dialogue. I think that would be fascinating and fun to watch. And this film really leaned into that. And for the most part did a good job and conveyed like personalities for the different monsters. Like, what Suko, the Kong Jr. of this film, is thinking and feeling at all moments based on his facial expressions. What Kong is thinking and feeling based on its facial expressions. Scar King's body language is really good. You just look at him, he's deranged and psychotic. And all of that is great. So as far as like conveying the personalities of the monsters, I think this film did a really good job with it. As far as doing the action scenes and the monster fights, I think this film really went balls to the walls and went crazy with it, with the anti-gravity fight, the fight in Brazil, Kong's various encounters with the different monsters in Hollow Earth. Godzilla gets a couple of battles thrown in there as he's powering up throughout the entire film. So there's a lot of fun to be had. And if you love monster action, I think this film definitely has you covered. Now, with all of that said, I do think Godzilla X Kong, The New Empire is probably my least favorite of the MonsterVerse films thus far. And there were certain things that they did that kind of prevented it from being as good as it could have been. Two big mistakes. Number one, the size of the monsters is somewhat lost in translation. And I think that came as they explored more and more of the Hollow Earth, like the size of the monsters and how massive that they're supposed to be kind of gets lost. I know there's that scene of of Kong and Suko walking across the big monster skeleton bridge, which is an impressive visual, but you kind of lose sense of the fact of how big King Kong is supposed to be and how big all of these monsters are supposed to be. And I think there were a couple of reviews that commented that when you get to the scene where Kong is in Scar King's lair, it almost feels like a scene out of Planet of the Apes rather than a giant kaiju film. And again, the size of the monster is kind of lost in translation through most of the film. And, when you're doing a giant monster movie, you do want to think of these things as massive, larger-than-life titans. And this is the first movie where, because the MonsterVerse typically did a pretty good job of that, which is harder to do with CGI, but I think especially the 2014 film did a really good job of making them look massive and huge. And this is the first time where that size, I don't feel like is conveyed properly. And the other problem with the film is with its villain. Now, I actually like Scar King a lot as a villain. I think there's a lot of potential there. Unfortunately, he is introduced into the film way, way too late, about an hour into a film that's less than 2 hours long. So the sense of the threat of like Scar King and Shimo being this world-ending threat is never properly conveyed, and it's never feels like the end of the world is coming because we don't spend enough time with Scar King, with Shimo. And again, I know I defended the 2014 film not having Godzilla in it enough, but they used Godzilla in big moments to kind of convey his sense of aura and power and everything else, and he was used effectively. Here it's like Scar King's supposed to be the main threat of the film, and you don't really feel like the world is in that much danger through most of it. And it kind of hurts the film dramatically that Scar King is in it so little. I think there's the scene in his lair where he deals with Kong and meets Kong initially. They have their fight, then Shimo's introduced and all that. And then there's the final battle, and that's pretty much it. You don't really get to spend a whole lot of time with Scar King or really get a sense of what his plan is. And, the idea of a giant ape, having a plan for world domination is funny enough on its own, but you don't really get a sense of like what Scar King is going to do and what is the end of humanity near if he gets out of the Hollow Earth and all that other stuff. So, I mean, compare that to King Ghidorah in the 2019 film, where it felt like King Ghidorah got loose and it felt like the world was ending. And that was conveyed properly. This one, Scar King just never really felt like that much of a threat. But those criticisms aside, it is a very fun film. It is an enjoyable film. It's fun to see Godzilla and Kong fight each other. It's fun to see Godzilla and Kong team up. I've compared their relationship to Rocky Balboa and Apollo Creed. It's like, yeah, they make great enemies, but when they join forces, it's even better. So this is kind of the Rocky 3 of Godzilla films, I guess you could say. So, Godzilla X Kong, it is a fun movie. And if you're looking for fun and just pure spectacle, I think this film has got you covered. And there's plenty to enjoy about it. I just wish they had tweaked a few things here and there that would have made it even better, but what can you do? So that is it. I've talked about the 8 Godzilla anniversary films, and hopefully if you're new to the series, that works as kind of like a baseline of where to begin if you want to jump into the series and watch these films. I've also talked about all the special Godzilla announcements, the -1 potential sequel, Godzilla and Digimon, the new manga, the short film that debuted on Godzilla Day, all good stuff. And I've talked about the new edition of my book, Godzilla, the Monster Fight Record. Be on the lookout for that. I will let you know when it gets published and released. But that is all I have for you now. Thanks again, everybody, for watching. If you want to see more, just be sure to like, subscribe, hit the little bell icon so you get notified when I post new videos. And that is it. So take care, and I will see you all next week.